Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. Tonight we have 13 accounts from people who went into the American backcountry and came back with something they can't explain. These are not exaggerations. These are not stories told around a fire for effect. These are the things people carried alone for years before they were willing to say them out loud. If you're new here, subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming. Turn the lights down. Let's begin. Story 1. My name is Darren Colquitt. I'm 41 years old and I work as a freight logistics coordinator out of Knoxville, Tennessee. I manage shipping schedules. I argue with carriers on the phone. I sit in front of 2 monitors for 10 hours a day and drink mediocre coffee out of a mug my daughter painted for me when she was 7. I don't hike competitively or anything like that. I just grew up near the mountains, and going out into them a few times a year feels like maintenance. Like something I need to do to keep the ratio right between screen time and actual sky. I know the terrain. I know how to read weather and how to read my own limits. I've been doing solo overnights since I was 19, and nothing, not a single thing in all those years, ever made me feel the way what happened on the Caldwell Fork Trail made me feel. It was a Thursday in late October. I'd taken Friday off work, so I had a long weekend lined up. I parked at the trailhead around noon, signed the register, shouldered my pack, and started in. My plan was to go out about 9 miles, camp near the creek bend I'd used 3 times before, and come back out Sunday morning. I knew the stretch well, done it 4 times, same season even. There was nothing exploratory about this trip. It was comfortable and familiar, and that was the whole point. The first day went fine. I passed 2 people heading out just after the first ridge, and then had the trail completely to myself. By the time I reached my campsite, the light was getting long and orange, and the air had that clean, cold snap that only comes in the mountains in October. I made camp efficiently, ate well, read for a while by headlamp, and slept harder than I had in months. I woke up just before 5 in the morning. Not to a sound, not to any identifiable stimulus. Just that sudden, complete awareness, like someone flipped a switch, and I was fully awake and alert before my eyes were even open. I lay still in my sleeping bag and listened. The creek was doing its thing 30 yards away. Wind moved slowly through the canopy, normal. The normal sounds of a normal October night in the Carolina mountains. I closed my eyes. Then I heard the talking. Not loud, not close, but distinct enough that I could tell it was 2 voices. Low, unhurried, like 2 people having a quiet conversation about something routine. Nothing urgent, nothing distressed. I could not make out words, it was just the rhythm of it. One voice and then the other, back and forth. The cadence of ordinary conversation. I checked my watch. 4:53 in the morning. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent, fly carefully, and looked out. The site was dark. My fire had been out for hours. I clicked on my headlamp and swept it around the clearing. Nothing. I sat listening. The talking continued at the same volume, at what seemed like the same distance, somewhere to the east, which was deeper into the trail, not the way I'd come in. It stopped around 5:15, not gradually, not fading out, just stopped. And then it was only the creek and the wind. I'm a rational person. I talked myself through it. 2 hikers camped further up the drainage, sound carrying strangely through the hollow. I've heard sounds do peculiar things in mountain terrain, bouncing off ridges channeled by water, making something far away seem close and something close seem far. I filed it under odd and tried to go back to sleep. I didn't, but I told myself I would, and eventually daylight started coming, and I got up. I broke camp at first light and started walking. About 2 miles in, I crossed a side drainage where the trail dipped low and the ground was soft and black with retained moisture. There in the mud, fresh, were boot prints. 2 sets. Different tread patterns. One a standard lug sole, one a more aggressive trail runner pattern. Walking parallel, heading the same direction I was heading. I crouched and studied the edges of the impressions. The mud hadn't filled or settled. These were from that morning, within the last hour or two. I stood up and kept going. 2 hikers, early starts, nothing unusual. I hadn't passed a side trail where they could have come in, but maybe they'd night hiked in and I'd missed their prints in the dark. I filed it under explainable and kept walking. I never caught up to them. By midday, I'd covered 6 miles of trail without seeing a single person. The boot prints had disappeared on rockier ground about a mile past the drainage. No side trails, no camping spots they could have ducked into. They had simply been there, and then the ground changed and they were no longer there. I stopped for lunch on a flat boulder overlooking a long hollow and sat there eating slowly, watching the trail below where it curved back into view. Nothing moved. No color, no sound of footsteps on leaves. Nothing. That afternoon, I passed the lean-to shelter at mile marker 14. I wasn't planning to stop, but something made me slow down as I approached. There was a jacket hanging on one of the support beams, not thrown carelessly over something, hung deliberately and precisely over a nail that had been driven into the wood for exactly that purpose. The collar settled around the nail head, the arms hanging straight, the fabric smoothed flat. A dark green canvas jacket heavy enough for the shoulder season, no pack beneath it. No food scraps, no gear, no boot prints in the soft soil at the base of the shelter platform. Just the jacket hanging there, as if someone had stepped out of it and expected to come back. I reached up and felt the front pockets. Empty. I checked the side pockets. Empty. I turned the collar back and looked at the label area. The back of the collar had been cut away, not torn, cut clean with something sharp. A 2-inch section of the collar seam removed. The kind of cut you'd make if you were removing a label with a name on it. The fabric around the cut was slightly stiff at the edges. I hung it back the way I found it and kept walking. I told myself there were explanations. I kept telling myself that for the rest of the afternoon. That night I chose a campsite well off trail, behind a dense screen of rhododendron that would have made me invisible to anyone passing. And I made camp without a fire. I ate cold food and I kept my headlamp off after the initial setup and sat in the dark for a long time just listening to the forest settle. The woods were quiet in the particular way they get when something has moved through and everything is waiting to see if it comes back. Around 1 a.m, I heard the voices again. Same quality. Same 2-voice rhythm, one and then the other. Nothing I could make into words, but clearly speech. And I want to be precise about this part because this is what I've thought about the most since. Same distance. Not the same general direction, the same distance. As if whatever or whoever was out there was tracking my position and deliberately maintaining a consistent gap between us. I had moved 6 miles from where I'd heard them before. I had camped in a concealed location, off-trail, with no fire and no light. And they were still there, still at what felt like roughly the same remove, maybe 150, 200 yards. I did not sleep. I sat with my knife open across my knee and watched the darkness outside the mesh of my tent until the sky began to change. When it was light enough to move safely, I left without cooking breakfast and covered the remaining miles at a pace that I would not call hiking. At the trailhead, I signed out in the register and sat in my truck for 20 minutes with the engine running before I felt settled enough to drive. I went back the following spring with a friend named Terrence, who does a lot of backcountry miles, and I trust his judgment. We walked the same stretch together in nice weather, a busy weekend with other hikers regularly on trail. We talked the whole way. Nothing felt wrong. The forest felt normal the way forests do when they're full of the right kind of human noise. When we passed the lean-to shelter, I looked at the support beam where the jacket had been hanging. There was no nail, no mark in the wood where a nail had been driven and pulled, no discoloration in the grain, no scar in the bark, no indication that anything had ever been fastened to that beam at all. The wood was continuous and unmarked and old. I stood looking at it for a moment, and Terrence asked if I'd been to the shelter before, and I said yes once. He nodded and kept walking, and I followed him out. I don't know if the nail was never there, and I invented it in the fear of that night, or if the nail was there and then it wasn't, and the beam healed over it in 6 months, the way nothing made of wood could possibly do. I've been a logistics coordinator for 17 years. My job is facts and accountability and the paper trail of things that happened. I have no paper trail for this. I have a memory of a jacket and a cut collar and a night of voices that kept their measured distance, and a spring morning looking at a beam with nothing on it. I still hike that trail, but I always sign in and out at the register, and I always tell someone where I'm going. Story 2. I want to be upfront about who I am before I tell you what happened to me, because I think context matters when you're asking someone to believe something unusual. My name is Philip O'Rourke. I'm a structural engineer. I'm trained to assess real-world conditions, identify failure points, quantify risk, and make decisions based on what can be observed and measured. My entire professional life is an exercise in not seeing things that aren't there, which is why what happened to me in the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois has sat in my chest like a splinter for going on 4 years now, because I cannot find the cause, and a cause is supposed to be there. I was 34 when it happened. I was on a solo hiking and photography trip through the Garden of the Gods area, extending out into the backcountry, beyond the recreational zones. 5 days, 4 nights. I know the area reasonably well, done shorter trips there before, know the terrain, the way the sandstone formations catch the light, the specific quality of silence in those woods that's different from anywhere else I've been. Day 2 was when I first noticed the tree. I want to describe it carefully because the tree is important to understanding what followed. It was a large oak, old-growth, substantial trunk, standing about 30 feet off the south side of the trail. What caught my eye was the coloring. The bark on the north face of the trunk had been stripped in a clean vertical strip about 8 inches wide, running from roughly waist height up to where the first major branch divided, maybe 14 feet above the ground. The exposed wood underneath was pale, almost white, and had clearly been exposed long enough to begin weathering at the edges. Not a fresh wound, something that had happened in a prior season and was gradually healing over. Deer rub, I thought, possibly black bear. I'm not a naturalist, but I know both leave marks on trees. I photographed it out of mild curiosity and continued on. 4 miles further along the trail, I came across a second tree with an identical strip. Same width, same placement on the north face of the trunk, same height range. I stopped and pulled up the photograph on my camera screen and held it next to the tree I was looking at. The dimensions were a precise match, not similar. Matching. I'm an engineer. I understand measurement and proportion, and what I was looking at was the same mark, reproduced exactly on a different tree 4 miles away. A third tree appeared 2 miles after that. Same mark, fourth another 1.5 miles. I started moving slower, watching the south side of the trail, looking ahead instead of at my feet. By the time I made camp that night, I had documented 5 of them in my field notes with GPS coordinates. I sat by my small fire and drew a rough line connecting the coordinates on my map. The marked trees were not random. They formed a line that ran parallel to the trail, consistently about 30 feet to the south, and that line was perfectly straight within the margin of natural variation. Whatever had made these marks was moving on a fixed bearing, pausing at specific trees, making the same mark, and continuing. I woke around 3 that night to the sensation of presence outside the tent. Not a sound I could name, not an identifiable noise. Just that specific awareness that the air near you is occupied. I lay still and breathed slowly and counted to 60, and then the sensation was gone, and the forest resumed its normal ambient sounds as if whatever had been there had concluded its business and moved on. In the morning, I found a single red ribbon tied to a branch about 4 feet from my tent door. Not new, but not ancient either. Weathered to a pale pink on one side where the sun had hit it. Tied in a specific knot that I recognized immediately, because it's a standard hitch used in survey flagging, a knot I use in my own professional work. Half hitch doubled, snug tight, the tag end tucked. Someone who worked in a field that uses survey tape had tied this, and they had tied it 4 feet from where I slept. Over the next 2 days, I documented 6 more marked trees, bringing the total to 11. And on the second to last night, sitting outside my tent in the dark, I heard the knocking. 3 slow, evenly spaced knocks on wood. A pause of perhaps 10 seconds. 3 more. Another pause. 3 more. Rhythmic, patient. Coming from roughly the direction of the tree line where the marked strip ran. Not a woodpecker whose rhythm is rapid and irregular. Not any sound I could attribute to wind or settling wood. 3 deliberate knocks, precisely timed, repeated over and over for approximately 20 minutes, until it stopped as suddenly as the bird calls had stopped 2 nights before. I have tried for 4 years to find a botanical or ecological explanation for those trees. I've consulted a botanist friend who was interested, but ultimately without an answer. I've described the knocking to 2 different people who study forest acoustics and received thoughtful non-explanations. What I haven't been able to do is stop hearing it when I'm trying to fall asleep in a quiet room. I did not return to finish my photography trip. I packed out on day 4. I have never told anyone the full version of this story before now. Story 3. People who know me know that I don't rattle easy. I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps, 2 deployments to places I don't discuss at dinner parties, and I've worked search and rescue as a volunteer in the Blue Ridge for going on a decade. I've carried bodies out of the woods. I've spent nights in conditions that would break most people, not because I'm extraordinary, but because I got comfortable with discomfort early and never lost that. I say this not to impress anyone, but to give you a baseline. When I tell you something scared me, I need you to understand what that means coming from me. My name is Garrett Lund. I'm 38 and I live in Asheville. What happened to me happened on a section of the Mountains to Sea Trail in western North Carolina about 4 years ago now, and I've told pieces of it to maybe 3 people in that time, which is unusual for me. I'm not a keeper of secrets, but this one has been hard to say out loud without feeling like I'm handing it to someone to dismiss. I was doing a solo training run, not a hike, a run. I do trail ultra events, and I use long solo runs in remote terrain as both physical and mental conditioning. I was running a 30-mile section, planning to be out and back before dark, full pack with emergency gear, because I've been doing this long enough to know what happens to people who don't take that seriously. I knew this particular route well. I'd run pieces of it before. Around mile 18, I stopped at a stream crossing to filter water and refill my bottles. And as I straightened up from the bank, I noticed someone watching me from across the water. He was standing in a gap between 2 large oaks, absolutely still, maybe 40 feet from where I was crouched. Older man, I thought, probably his 60s. Gray stubble, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket that looked too heavy for the weather. He had nothing. No pack, no water source of his own that I could see, no visible reason to be standing motionless in the woods, watching a stranger filter water at a stream crossing. I called out. Nothing. I raised a hand. No response. I finished filtering, capped my bottles, stood up to full height, and when I looked back across the stream, he was gone. I had been looking at the ground for maybe 30 seconds. I ran on. 18 miles in, 8 miles of technical trail left, plenty of daylight. I wasn't going to slow down over a strange moment at a stream. Mile 22, I hit a long switchback section that climbed an exposed ridge. No tree cover for maybe half a mile, the trail clearly visible in both directions. I was about halfway up the switchback when I felt it, the physical sense of someone directly behind me. Not imagined, not suggested by anxiety. My body reacted before my conscious mind did. The hair on my arms, a shift in my breathing. I turned around. The trail was empty as far back as I could see, which on that ridge was a long way. I turned and ran on. At the top of the ridge, I looked back again, down the full length of the switchback below me. He was at the bottom. Same man, same jacket, same posture, standing at the base of the switchback, where I had been perhaps 5 minutes earlier. He was not running. He was not breathing hard. He was standing the way he had been standing at the stream, completely still, and he was looking up at me. The distance between where he stood and where I was standing at the top of that ridge was not something a man of his age and build could cover on foot in 5 minutes on technical uphill trail. Not at a walk, not without me hearing him, not without me seeing him on the completely exposed trail below me as I climbed. He raised one hand, not a wave, palm out held steady, like something between a greeting and a signal. I turned and ran the final 8 miles at a pace I have never matched before or since. I hit the trailhead, got to my truck, sat on the hood, and stared at the tree line for a while before I could make myself drive. 3 weeks later, I brought it up with another local trail runner, a woman named Cassie Thorne, who logged serious miles in the same terrain. I didn't frame it as my experience. I just asked if she'd ever encountered anything unusual on that stretch. She put down her coffee and looked at me. She described a man she'd seen twice, different days, different conditions, always still, always watching. No gear. She'd asked around among the local trail community, and 2 other runners had similar accounts. Nobody had seen the man arrive or leave from a trailhead. Nobody had seen him move. Nobody has found an explanation. I've been back on that trail section twice since then. Once with a group, once solo. On the solo run around mile 20, I had that feeling again. The physical sense of something behind me, the static on the back of the neck, the change in breath. I turned around. Empty trail. I turned back and kept running. When I crested the next ridgeline, I looked back down the switchback below me. Nothing. Just trail and trees and afternoon light. But I noticed I'd picked up my pace by about 90 seconds per mile without being aware of doing it. My body knew something before my mind did, and it wasn't going to argue about it. I don't know what the man was. I don't know how he moved the way he moved or appeared the way he appeared. I know that Cassie Thorne and the others are real people with reliable accounts. I know that between us, we have seen or experienced the same thing in the same location across different years and conditions. I know that in search and rescue, when you get consistent independent reports of the same thing in the same area, you don't dismiss them. You start looking. I'm still looking. Story 4, I'm a hospice nurse. My name is Ren Calloway, and I'm 46, and I work rotating shifts that hollow you out slowly if you're not careful about finding somewhere to pour yourself back in. I love my work. I want to be clear about that. I love the patients and the families and the particular intimacy of the work, but it takes something from you that doesn't automatically come back. And if you don't find a way to go get it, you end up running on empty in a way that looks like fine to everyone around you. For me, the replacement is the backcountry, real backcountry, not day hikes to overlooks crowded with families on long weekends. I mean, 4 or 5 days alone in remote terrain with a full pack and no itinerary beyond a general direction. I've done it every year for 12 years. Pacific Northwest, New Mexico, Appalachians, once in Scotland that nearly killed me in a very different way. That makes a good story for a different time. I know what I'm doing out there. I know how to read terrain, read my body, and read the quality of silence well enough to know when something is wrong with it. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. Late May, 4 nights out. A long loop through relatively mild terrain in the Cumberland section, where the sandstone bluffs drop into creek hollows thick with rhododendron. I was 3 full days in, had found my rhythm, was sleeping properly for the first time in months. Felt genuinely good in a way that's different from feeling good at home. On the afternoon of day 3, I came across a campsite that someone had set up and then, by all appearances, simply walked away from mid-task. There was a small backpacking stove on a flat rock, fully assembled, fuel canister attached, igniter in position. Beside it, a pot with cold water in it, maybe a cup's worth. Beside the pot, a freeze-dried meal pouch, torn open and empty. But the pot held nothing cooked. Either they'd used the meal some other way, or they'd opened it intending to cook and then left before doing so. The tent was staked and the poles were in place, but the rainfly was bundled beside it, unattached, half set up, like they'd gotten that far and then been interrupted. I called out multiple times in different directions. I walked a wide circle around the site and found no sign of anyone nearby. No footprints leading away in the soft soil around the fire ring, which was notable. The site had been reached somehow, and then whoever had set it up had apparently vanished without leaving a trail out. I continued on, noting the GPS location in case it became relevant later. That night, and I have described this to a sleep neurologist and to a psychologist, both of whom offered thoughtful frameworks that did not fully account for the details. I woke at approximately 2 in the morning, and I was standing outside my tent. Standing upright, boots on my feet but unlaced and loose, about 15 feet from the tent door. Fully conscious and completely unable to account for how I'd gotten there. I had no memory of unzipping the tent, no memory of standing, no partial memory of a half-waking state that might explain it. I was simply standing in the dark outside my tent, facing the trees. I stood there for what I estimate was 2 minutes, trying to take an inventory. My hands were at my sides. I had not brought my headlamp or my knife, both of which I keep within arm's reach at all times. The forest in front of me was dark and absolutely still. I had no sense of having been pulled toward anything or called toward anything. There was no stimulus I could identify. I simply was there when a moment before I had been inside. I turned around and walked back to the tent and sat up for the rest of the night. In the morning, in the soft soil outside the tent, I could see my own prints going out and my own prints coming back in. And between those two sets, angled away from my tent toward the tree line, there was a partial set of bare footprints, large, possibly a large male foot, pressed deeper at the ball than the heel, which means whatever made them was moving at speed in that direction. They led about 8 feet into the heavier leaf litter at the base of the tree line, and then the substrate changed and I could find nothing more. There were no prints returning. I'm a clinical person. I work in environments that require me to stay grounded and functional under emotionally extreme circumstances. I do not believe in the supernatural as a category of explanation. I believe there is something that explains what happened in that forest, and I simply do not have enough information to know what it is. And that uncertainty has sat with me every day since in a way that does not have a name. I've told the sleep neurologist that I sleepwalk. I've told the psychologist about the dissociative quality of the morning memory. I haven't told either of them about the footprints, the bare feet going toward the trees and not coming back. I'm not sure what branch of medicine handles that specific piece of information, and I'm not in a hurry to find out. What I do now is loop a thin piece of paracord through my tent zipper and around my wrist before I sleep. It's not foolproof, but it's something. Story 5. The thing I want to establish first is that my son was with me, and he was 11 years old, and he saw what I saw, and he still talks about it. Not often, but sometimes, at 20 now, when the conversation goes somewhere that touches on it. I'm not a lone witness to this. I was not alone in the woods, and I was not alone in seeing it, and the other witness is my own child, who had no concept of what he was seeing or any reason to construct it. My name is Boyd Sheridan. I'm 53. I was 42 when this happened. My son Eli and I were camping in the Cohutta Wilderness in northern Georgia over a long weekend in early June. He was at an age where the outdoors still felt like an adventure rather than a chore, and I was making the most of it while it lasted. We weren't deep in, maybe 4 miles from the trailhead, at a spot I'd used before near a small pond that goes loud with frogs in the evenings. Good spot for a kid. Safe, familiar to me, nothing technical. We had a good first day. Built a proper camp, made dinner over a fire, did the standard things. He was asleep by 9 and I sat outside for another hour looking at the sky and then turned in. I slept well. Around midnight, Eli shook me awake, and I came alert fast the way I do when he's the one doing the waking, because there's a quality to a child calling you out of sleep that bypasses the normal, slow return to consciousness. He was sitting up in his bag, and in the dark, I could see from his posture that he was not sleepy and not imagining things. He said quietly in the particular voice that means he's actually scared rather than performing it, Dad. There's someone looking at us. Our tent had a mesh inner wall and a solid fly that was partially unzipped at one end for ventilation. Through the mesh, I could see the area outside the tent dimly by moonlight that came through the partial fly opening. And through that mesh, I could see a shape outside, not moving. Low, crouched down at the edge of the lit area, maybe 8 feet from the tent wall. I want to be careful about this because I have gone over it many times. It was not a bear. The proportions were wrong for a bear, and the positioning was wrong. Bears don't crouch like that. It was not a deer. The shape was wrong, the height was wrong. It was person-shaped in the way that crouching things can be person-shaped, and it was still in the way that nothing outside at night is still. I put my hand on Eli's arm firmly and told him without moving my lips very much to stay completely still. I reached for my flashlight and I positioned it at the mesh opening and I turned it on. The space was empty. In the time it took me to aim and switch the light on, half a second at most, whatever had been there was gone. Not moving away, not visible at any edge of the beam. Simply absent. I swept the light back and forth across the camp and found nothing. I listened and heard nothing. I told Eli it was shadows from the moon. He's always been perceptive, and he gave me a look that told me he was taking my explanation out of politeness. He lay back down. I did not. I sat in the dark with the flashlight ready and waited until the sky turned pale and I could see the trees clearly. In the morning, Eli asked to go home. Not dramatically, not with elaboration. He just said quietly while eating a granola bar, "I want to go home today, Dad, if that's okay." And I packed us out. Before I took the tent down, I walked the perimeter of the camp slowly. In the pine needles on the side of the tent nearest where we'd seen the shape, there were compressions in the duff. Not footprints exactly, not clear enough for that, but the settled, depressed areas where weight had rested. Arranged in a pattern that matched a crouching position, 2 feet and 2 hands. And then a single long disturbance in the pine needles that went backward about 4 feet, as if something had launched itself back very fast from where it was crouching. Eli and I have talked about it twice since. Once when he was 16 and once last year. He remembers exactly what I remember. He adds one detail that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He says he watched it for almost a full minute before he woke me up. He says he could see where the head was by the way the moonlight didn't reach past it. He says it was facing the tent and not moving at all, and that the reason he waited was that some part of him believed that if neither of them moved, it might leave on its own. He was 11 years old, and he was right. Story 6. I was working as a freelance sound recordist when this happened. Film and documentary projects mostly, some commercial work, occasional nature recording for stock libraries. I'm 40 now. This happened when I was 32, and it changed the way I hear the world, which for someone whose entire livelihood depends on listening, is not a small thing to say. My name is Alton Vess. I went to the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia alone for a week of nature audio work. I had approximately $12,000 worth of recording equipment, a proper backpacking setup, and a detailed session plan for the sounds I wanted to capture. Dawn chorus at multiple elevations, water systems at different flow rates, wind moving through different tree types, the specific acoustic signature of that forest, which is unlike anywhere else I've worked, a density and warmth to the ambience that you can't replicate. The first 2 days were productive in the exact way I'd hoped. The light was good, the conditions were stable, and I was in that meditative state that comes when your whole job is to listen to the world rather than talk over it. Day 3, before dawn, I was positioned in a small clearing with my rig running, full stereo configuration, headphones on, monitoring the live feed. I'd been recording for about 40 minutes, building a beautiful dawn chorus, layer after layer of different species coming in as the light changed, when the birds stopped. Not gradually, not one by one, trailing off, all at once. Every bird in that chorus, and there must have been 30 or 40 individual voices representing at least 15 species, went silent in the same instant. The recording shows it clearly. One moment, full chorus, next moment, nothing. I held position and kept monitoring through the headphones. Wind in the canopy, distant water, the sound of my own controlled breathing. And then with the clarity that $1,500 microphones are built to deliver, footsteps, slow, from the north tree line. One step, a pause of approximately 4 seconds, another step, another pause. Not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate. Something moving through the north edge of the clearing in no particular rush. I turned my head toward the sound slowly. I could not see the north edge from where I was sitting. The light was still low. I pulled one ear cup off and listened with my unassisted ear. There it was, exactly as the recording had it. Step, long pause, step, patient even, unhurried. Then my recording picked up a second set of footsteps. South tree line. Different pace, slightly heavier, moving in the same clearing crossing direction, converging on the first set from the opposite side. I was sitting in the middle. I have replayed this section of the recording hundreds of times. The two sets of footsteps cross the open clearing from north and south respectively, and meet somewhere in the trees to the east. The moment they would have met, both sets stop simultaneously. There are no voices, no animal sounds at any point. No indication that either set of footsteps paused or hesitated. They simply approached from opposite directions, crossed the clearing, and stopped. 18 minutes later, exactly 18 minutes, the birds came back. Not gradually, all at once the same way they'd stopped. An audio engineer friend of mine listened to the recording. He said the footsteps were human in their cadence and weight distribution. He had no explanation for why two people would converge on a remote clearing before dawn, stop when they met, and then apparently cease to exist. He asked me if I'd confronted them. I told him I hadn't. He said he understood. I've done field recording in wild areas, maybe 30 times since that morning in the Monongahela. My equipment is better, and my patience is better, and my ability to stay inside a session without my mind wandering has improved. But I've changed one practice. I no longer record with my eyes closed. I know it affects the quality of what I capture. I know it makes me slightly less effective at the exact thing I'm out there to do. I changed it anyway. There are mornings in a clearing before dawn when I hear something at the edge of the frame that I cannot explain, and I need to be looking at the world when that happens. I listen to that recording less than I used to. Not because I've stopped being curious, but because I've accepted that I won't find the answer in the waveform. And listening to it the way I have been, looking for the thing I missed, is starting to feel like something else. Like a way of staying close to something I should probably put some distance between myself and 18 minutes. Every time I check. Exactly 18. Story 7. I want to start by saying I've never told the complete version of this to anyone except my wife, and I only told her because She found me sitting on the back porch at 3 in the morning 6 months after it happened, staring at the yard with a cup of cold coffee. And she asked me what was wrong, and she deserved a real answer. My name is Rudy Fenchurch. I'm 51. I teach a P history at a high school in Chattanooga. I'm not an outdoorsman by identity. I hike occasionally. I camp a few times a year, always with someone else, always on established trails. What I am is a loyal friend, and my friend Dale Abrams came out of a hard divorce in the spring of the year this happened. And when he said he needed to do something physical and long and far from his house with a person he trusted, I said yes without thinking too hard about it. We did 4 days on the Benton-McCoy Trail in late July. The heat was significant. Our packs were heavy. We were sweating inside of 20 minutes every single day. But Dale talked, which was the whole point, getting it out of his system, sorting through the past 18 months out loud with someone who would listen and not judge. And I listened, and we were doing exactly what we'd set out to do. Day 3, early afternoon, Dale went quiet. He had his interior days on the trail, and this was one. We'd been walking in comfortable silence for maybe an hour when we came around a long curve in the trail and found a boy sitting on a flat rock in the center of the path. Young, 8 or 9 maybe, not older than 10. He was wearing a light nylon jacket, the kind parents buy their kids for spring soccer, and blue jeans, and he had nothing with him. No pack, no water bottle, no snack wrapper, no evidence of any supply for a trail that we were 4 miles deep on. He was sitting with his hands folded on his knees, looking straight down the trail in the direction we'd come from, and he did not look up when we approached. Dale said hello from about 20 feet away. The boy turned and looked at us. His face was completely neutral, and I mean that in a specific way. Not calm, not frightened, not relieved to see people. Neutral in the way that doesn't quite look like any emotion you know how to name. Like a face with the usual signals removed. I crouched down to bring myself to eye level. I asked him where his parents were. He said he didn't know. I asked how he'd gotten here. He said he walked. I asked from where, what direction. He pointed behind him, the direction we'd come from. The direction we'd been walking for 3 hours without passing a single person, or a single trailhead, or any access point. We had not passed a child. There was nowhere between the last trailhead and where we stood that a child could have joined the trail. There was no possibility he had been behind us for any of that distance without our knowing. Dale crouched beside me and asked the boy his name. He said it was Caleb. Dale asked his last name. Caleb looked at us for a moment with that same empty expression and said he didn't want to say it. Not that he couldn't remember. That he didn't want to say. We sat with him for 20 minutes. I kept my voice easy and I asked him questions, and he answered most of them without hesitation, in a level, unhurried voice that was itself unusual. He knew approximately where he was. He said he'd been on the trail for 2 days, by himself. He showed no signs of dehydration or sun exposure despite the conditions. When I offered him water, he shook his head. When Dale offered a granola bar, he shook his head the same way. I told him we needed to get him to a road so we could find his family. He said okay, and he stood up and he walked in front of us, setting the pace, leading, which was strange in a way that didn't fully register until later, when I had time to sit with it. He walked ahead like he knew where we were going, like he was taking us somewhere. For 1.5 miles he walked this way. Then Dale stopped to check the map, and the boy stopped too, and turned and looked at us, and said, in that same level voice, "You should probably go back the other way." Not we should, you should. Looking at us like this was a recommendation he was making on our behalf. Dale laughed the way you laugh when something is uncomfortable, and you don't know what else to do. "We're getting you to the road," he said. The boy turned and walked ahead again. He led us to a forest road junction I hadn't known existed, a rough cut that wasn't on the trail maps. Parked there was an old pickup truck, dark blue, no visible license plates. A man was sitting on the tailgate, 50-something, sunburned, thick through the arms. When the boy walked into the clearing, the man said, without looking at us, "Took you long enough." Not asked the boy if he was okay, not expressed relief, just that directed at the child like a mild complaint. The boy walked to the tailgate without looking back at us. Dale asked if the man was his father. The man looked at us, then a long, flat look, for what I would estimate was 5 seconds. Then he said we could leave now. Not please, not thank you for finding him. We could leave now. Said in a tone that made the word could mean something different than it usually does. I grabbed Dale's arm before he could say anything else and pulled him back toward the trail opening, and we walked, and I did not let go of his arm until we were out of earshot. We went about 2 miles before either of us spoke. Dale said, "What was that?" And I said, "I don't know." And we left it there because there wasn't anywhere else to take it. I reported it to local authorities when we came out. I described the boy, described the man, described the truck without plates, gave the approximate junction location. I don't know what came of it. Nobody called me. Nobody followed up. I've thought about the boy's face, the absence in it, more times than I can count. I've thought about the word Caleb, and whether that was a real name given by a real person or something chosen for a specific reason. I've thought about the way the man on the tailgate spoke to the boy and what the history of that relationship might look like and what kind of home the boy was going back to. I think about it less than I used to, but I haven't stopped. Story 8. My name is Janelle Pruitt, and I'm a licensed land surveyor working primarily in southwestern Virginia and eastern Tennessee. I've spent more hours in the backcountry than most professional hikers, not recreationally, but professionally, walking old property lines through terrain that hasn't seen a human presence in decades, sometimes longer. I've surveyed in places where the trees are ancient and close, and the light doesn't reach the ground, and the silence is a physical thing you move through rather than simply hear. I know how to be alone in the woods, and I know how to stay rational when things feel wrong. This happened approximately 2 years ago on a solo survey job for a piece of disputed timberland that abutted the Jefferson National Forest in a section of the county where the roads are bad and the cell signal is non-existent, and the people who live nearby know better than to venture far without reason. The landowner had given me access documentation and a rough sketch of the line location. My job was to walk the boundary using historical records, going back to the 1950s, and re-establish monuments that may have been lost or moved. The first day was hard work but standard. Dense brush, old growth, steep in places. Found 2 of the original monuments, which was better than the records had led me to expect. Set up camp that evening at the base of a ridge and slept soundly. Second day I was working the northern section of the line, moving slow and careful through thick understory when I came across the structures. I want to be deliberate about how I describe them, because I am aware of how certain descriptions can slide into the kind of language that invites dismissal. They were small constructions, roughly 3 feet high, built from branches woven together around a central arrangement of flat stones, not naturally occurring, not the random accumulation of debris, built carefully and deliberately by something with fine motor capability and intention. There were 4 of them, each approximately the same height and density, spaced about 60 feet apart, running in a line that crossed the property boundary at a perfect perpendicular. Like markers, but not the kind I'd ever been paid to set. I photographed them for my own record, noted the coordinates, and continued working. I'm a professional. I don't stop working because I find something I can't immediately explain. That second night I woke at approximately 1:30 and became aware within a few seconds of waking that something was wrong with the acoustic pattern of the forest around me. It took several more seconds to identify what. The usual ambient sounds, insects, small movements in the undergrowth, settling wood, were present, but they were being regularly interrupted by brief periods of complete silence. Not long, 2 or 3 seconds, but regular, happening on a cycle. 38 seconds of normal sound, then 3 seconds of nothing, then sound resumed. I lay and timed it for over 2 hours. The cycle was consistent, but not perfectly metronomic. 35 seconds, then silence. 41 seconds, then silence. The irregularity, the slight variance, was what made it feel less like a mechanical source and more like something that breathed. Nothing came close to the tent. I heard nothing that identified a specific creature or person, just that rhythm for over 2 hours until it stopped. When I started work the following morning, I moved the survey equipment from my tent to the line I was working and past the tree I'd been using as a baseline reference point on the eastern side of my campsite. Directly against the base of that tree was a fifth structure, identical to the other four. It had not been there when I'd set up camp. I had noted the tree specifically as a reference, and I had looked at the base of it when I established camp. The structure had been placed within perhaps 12 feet of where I'd been sleeping, while the 2-hour silence kept its count outside. Inside, the lattice of branches was a piece of fabric, blue, approximately 2 inches square, folded once, set in the exact center of the stone base. I did not touch it. I photographed it. I walked back to the survey line and completed the job. I drove home that evening 2 hours of mountain roads in the dark and charged the fuel as a miscellaneous business expense and never explained it to my supervisor because there was no explanation he would have found useful. I've done survey work in dozens of remote locations since then. I've spent nights alone in the field and terrain as isolated as, or more isolated than that property boundary. I've heard sounds I couldn't identify and found marks I couldn't explain and attributed most of them to the ordinary strangeness of old wilderness that doesn't have human presence enough to be thoroughly mapped. But I have not returned to that section. The landowner's dispute was eventually resolved by other means, and the job was closed out and there was no professional reason to go back. What I think about when I think about it is the fabric inside the last structure, 2 inches of blue cloth folded once, centered precisely on the stone base. Not left there by accident, not dropped, placed by something that understood placement, that understood center, that understood the message communicated by careful arrangement. Whatever was making those structures was not finished when I found them. The circuit was still ongoing. The rhythm was still counting, and whatever had decided to put the last one against the tree nearest to where I slept had also decided, for whatever reason, to put something inside it that was for me to find. I'd rather not think too hard about what that means, but I do sometimes in the middle of the night. When the house is quiet and there's no sound from outside and the silence has a quality to it that I recognize from the field. I recognize it because I've heard it before. Counting. Story 9. I need you to know something before I start. I found out after the fact that I was not the only person to report something wrong in that section of forest during that particular 2-week period. I know this because when I made my own report, the woman who took the information told me quietly, in a way that suggested she was deciding as she spoke whether to say it, that mine was the 3rd call she'd received with overlapping elements. She wouldn't tell me what the other 2 accounts contained, but she said 3rd, same area, same 2-week window. I don't know what to do with that information except include it when I tell the story, because it changes something about how alone I was and whatever happened, and I think you should have that. My name is Seth Arrowood. I'm 29. I was 26 when this happened. I'm a landscape photographer, and I was doing a 4-night trip in the Great Smoky Mountains, specifically targeting some of the less traveled ridgeline sections north of the main corridor. I'd been planning the trip for 8 months to hit a specific atmospheric window for high elevation fog and cloud conditions. This was a work trip as much as a personal one. I was 2 days in and in good spirits when I found the camp. I only reached it because I'd moved off the trail into the understory looking for a particular angle on a rock formation, and the hollow it sat in was not visible from the trail itself. Maybe 40 meters off the path, screened by a stand of young hemlocks. The camp was complete and current. Two-person tent, staked properly and pitched correctly. Cooking gear arranged on a flat sandstone shelf. A pair of hiking boots outside the tent door, set side by side and parallel, laced and settled straight as if by habit. An expensive camera bag leaning against a tree with the top clips fastened. No garbage, no food waste. Everything orderly, everything indicating a camp that was being maintained by people who knew what they were doing. I called out, I waited, and I walked a circle around the site. No response, no sign of anyone. I looked inside the tent. Two sleeping bags in their compression sacks, unrolled but not yet opened. Two sleeping pads laid out. A small lantern in the corner, off. Two phone charging cables coiled beside it, no phones attached. The tent smelled lived in, the way tents do, after a few nights of use. This was not a camp that had been abandoned before it was used. I tried to read how long ago the site had been active. The cooking gear was clean and dry. The boots were dry on the outside, though the previous night had brought light rain. The sleeping bags showed no condensation. Everything pointed to recent. I wrote a brief note with my contact information and the date and time and placed it under a flat stone beside the cooking gear. Then I moved on. That night, 3 miles further on an exposed ridge with a long view of a valley to the west, I was working late on field notes, and I saw lights in the valley below, moving small like a single headlamp, working through the valley floor in an irregular search pattern. Stopping, backing up, changing direction, not hiking, searching. I watched it for roughly 40 minutes before it went out. I returned to the hollow the next morning because I'd been thinking about the camp since I'd left it and I couldn't stop. The gear was still there. The note I'd left was still under the stone. Everything looked the same, except the camera bag. It had been opened. The main compartment, closed when I'd been there before, was now unzipped. Inside were 2 lenses, lens filters, cleaning equipment, all present. The camera body itself was gone. Nothing else was missing. Only the camera. I reported it at the ranger station on my way out, described the location as precisely as I could. And that's when the woman behind the desk told me about the other calls. I still have the photographs I took of the camp. I've thought about posting them many times. I haven't because the camp contained people's belongings. And those people may be findable and may not want to be found in that particular way. Or they may be something else entirely, and I don't know which. And that uncertainty keeps me from doing anything with what I have. Story 10. I want to be clear about who I am because I think it's relevant. I'm a commercial diver. My name is Rex Halverson. I'm 44, and I've spent my career working in environments that most people would find unendurable. Inside shipwrecks, beneath oil platforms, in waters cold enough to kill you in minutes if something goes wrong. My job is managing risk in systems that will end you if you misread them. I'm not given to panic, and I'm not given to seeing things that aren't there. I'm trained from the ground up to assess what is real, because in my field, the alternative to accuracy is your body being recovered by someone else. I tell you this because what I experienced on the Finger Lakes Trail in upstate New York, on a 5-day solo trip in early September, was the kind of thing I keep to myself precisely because of who I am. Because people hear what I do, and they expect a certain kind of account from me. And this is not that kind of account. But I've kept it too long, and I want it somewhere outside of my own head. Day 2 of the trip, I became aware that something was following me. I did not see it. I heard it. A consistent sound at a consistent interval behind me. The compression of a boot on trail, the slight variation in pitch that comes from a specific tread pattern on specific substrate. In my work, I'm trained to isolate and identify sounds in complex acoustic environments. This was not ambiguous. I stopped walking. The sound stopped simultaneously. I started walking. After approximately 20 seconds, it resumed. I did this 3 times. Each time the stop and start matched mine within a second. I stepped off the trail into the brush and waited for 8 minutes. Nobody passed. After I returned to the trail and continued, the sound did not resume until I'd gone approximately a quarter mile. Over the next 2 days, this pattern continued with variations. Sometimes it was closer. Once it seemed to be ahead of me around a bend. And when I came around the bend, the trail was empty and the sound stopped the instant I would have been able to see the source. Night 4, I woke to find my boot laces had been threaded through each other. Right boot to left boot, the laces interlaced in a deliberate pattern that would have taken several minutes to complete. Not knotted, not tied into something that couldn't be undone. Just woven together carefully and precisely in the dark, outside my tent while I slept. I sat with that for a long time before I cut them apart with my pocket knife and relaced them from the eyelets up. I thought about what that act communicated. It wasn't destructive. Nothing was damaged. It wasn't a theft. Nothing was taken. It was a demonstration of access and patience and the choice not to do anything worse. Someone who wanted to hurt me could have done so while I was sleeping and didn't. Someone wanted me to know they were there and that they had been there long enough to do something that required time and care, and that they had chosen to do this rather than something else. On the last night, I addressed the tree line directly, out loud, at a normal speaking volume. I said, I know you're there, and I know how long you've been following me, and I want you to understand that if I become aware of your proximity again before I leave this trail, I will not wait to determine your intentions. Then I went back in the tent. There was a long silence, then footsteps moving away, diminishing, gone. I drove home the next morning, and I have thought about those boot laces more times than anything else. The time it took, the patience, the choice. Whatever was out there had decided on a very specific message and had delivered it. I'm still not entirely sure what the message was. What I keep returning to is the framing of it. In my work, when we assess a hazardous situation, we ask what the actor's options were and what they chose from among those options. Whatever was in those woods had a full range of options while I slept. It could have done anything. It chose to thread one bootlace through another, carefully and completely, without waking me, without leaving any other evidence of its presence. It chose the smallest possible demonstration and executed it with precision. That's not rage. That's not predation. I don't have a word for what it is. My ex-wife says I got strange after that trip. Said I started checking things twice. Windows and locks and the positioning of objects on the nightstand. Said I'd developed a habit of sitting with my back to walls in restaurants that I'd never had before. I don't disagree with any of that. I think she's right. I think something recalibrated in me after 5 days on that trail. Some basic assumption about what kinds of things occupy the same world I do and what their intentions might be. The recalibration has not fully settled. I'm not sure it's gonna. I keep my boots inside the tent every night, in any outdoor environment. No exceptions. People I hike with now sometimes notice and ask about it. I tell them it's a habit. That's true. It just isn't the whole story. Story 11. My name is Celeste Burghardt. I'm 37. I teach the 7th grade science in a small town in the western corner of Pennsylvania. And I want to tell you clearly that before the trip I'm about to describe, I was not an experienced backcountry person. Car camping as a child, a few car camping trips as an adult. That was essentially my outdoor resume. This 6-day loop through the Allegheny National Forest was my first real solo backpacking trip, planned carefully over about 6 months, vetted by a more experienced friend, approached with the kind of preparation that I hope communicated to the universe that I was taking it seriously. The first 3 days were difficult and wonderful in the way that first serious trips tend to be. Tired in muscles I hadn't known I had. Slow in the climbs, but genuinely happy in a way that the classroom, which I also love, doesn't produce. Day 4, mid-morning, I found the note. It was folded once and placed under a flat rock on the right side of the trail, propped against a low stone outcrop at approximately my eye level. placed in a way that made it findable without being obvious. You had to be looking at the right angle to see the corner of the paper. My name was on the outside, my first name, Celeste, printed in black ink, capital letters, neat and deliberate. I stood on the trail and looked at it for a long time before I picked it up. My name is not common, but it's not impossible. I kept trying to construct an explanation where this was coincidence. Someone else named Celeste had passed through and left a note for someone else, and someone else had propped it against that rock. But I was 4 days into a 6-day loop. The last person I'd passed had been going the other direction on day 2, and I had not registered my name at any public board or trail register in the section I was currently on. Inside the fold was a single sentence. It said, "You should turn around at the creek crossing tomorrow." No name, no signature, no other text, no context, no explanation, no indication of who had written it, or how they knew to put it there, or how they knew my name, or how they knew my route. Someone on this trail, somewhere in the forest I was currently walking through alone, knew my name and knew I would encounter a creek crossing the following day, and had decided they wanted me to turn around before I reached it. I sat down on a log for about 15 minutes and did what I believe is the rational thing to do in the presence of information you don't understand, which is to think carefully about your options and their consequences. I had 3. I could turn around immediately, 2 days early, and go back the way I'd come. I could continue as planned, cross the creek on day 5, and treat the note as a coincidence or a prank. Or I could alter my route to avoid the creek crossing without abandoning the trip entirely. I altered my route. I added 3 miles going around, came out at a different point, arranged for my friend to pick me up a half day early. I never saw the creek crossing. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office when I got home. They took my information politely, and I never heard back. I still have the note in a plastic sleeve in my filing cabinet. The handwriting is small and careful, and completely unfamiliar. I have thought about what was at the creek crossing every single day since. There are 2 possibilities that I keep returning to. The note was a warning from someone with good intentions and enough knowledge of my trip to know where and when to place it. Or the note was designed to move me off my planned route, to redirect me somewhere, and by choosing to go around rather than through, I avoided not the creek crossing, but the person who wrote the note. I genuinely cannot determine which of those explanations is more frightening. What I've done with that uncertainty is this. I've framed it as a scientific question, which is the only way I know how to hold something that doesn't resolve. I've listed the variables I know. My name was on the note, so I was identifiable. My route was specific enough to be anticipated, so I was trackable. The note was placed in advance of my arrival, so someone was ahead of me on the trail and watching for me. Someone with those 3 pieces of information made a decision to communicate rather than confront, and the content of the communication was a recommendation about where not to go. What I can't list is why. And in science, why is sometimes the only question that matters. I'm planning another solo trip for next spring. Different forest, different state, different register name. I will tell exactly one person where I'm going, and I will not tell anyone else. I'm aware that this is probably excessive caution. I'm also aware that there is a note in a plastic sleeve in my filing cabinet with my first name on it in someone else's handwriting, and that the person who wrote it knew my name and my route and my timing, and that I still don't know who they were or what was at the creek. I'm going anyway. Some things you have to go toward. Story 12. The year I turned 31, I took a leave of absence from my job as an architectural draftsman and spent 3 months attempting the Continental Divide Trail. I got roughly halfway through New Mexico before the money ran out, and I had to call it and go back to a desk and a salary. I'm 36 now. I've done sections of long trails since, but nothing that ambitious again. What I keep from that trip, the thing I can't put down, isn't the terrain or the miles or any of the experiences I expected to have. It's a 20-minute conversation at a water cache outside of Pie Town, with a man who told me something that I've turned over in my mind nearly every day since. My name is Curtis Aberley. The man's name, or the name he gave me, was Harlan. That's all I have. He came up from the south while I was filtering water. 60-something, lean, face that looked like it had spent a lot of seasons outdoors, wearing trail gear that showed serious mileage. Real pack, proper equipment. He sat down near the cache and began the standard process of checking his water supply. And I began the standard process of small talk that thru hikers use to establish whether someone is worth talking to or not, which mostly comes down to whether their trail information is accurate and whether they have interesting things to say. His information was accurate. We talked for maybe 15 minutes about conditions north of where we were, water sources, the expected weather window, which sections of the upcoming terrain were more exposed than the map suggested. He was knowledgeable and specific. I was enjoying the conversation. Then he asked me if I'd noticed anything following behind me over the past few days on the trail. I said no, and I meant it. I hadn't noticed anything. He nodded and was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he'd expected that answer and was deciding what to do with it. He told me about an experience he'd had on a section of the PCT 7 or 8 years prior. He'd been alone, 12 days into a remote section, when he started noticing what he described as a pressure. Not pain, not a physical sensation exactly. More like the persistent awareness of something nearby that wasn't natural in the way the trail environment was natural. He said it manifested in specific and consistent ways over about 10 days. Sounds that stopped at the exact instant he turned towards them, not fading out, but stopping like a switch. Personal items moved small distances from where he'd placed them. A water filter set 18 inches from where he'd left it. Boots aligned differently. His notebook opened to a different page. Small, undeniable, impossible to attribute to anything he could name. And throughout it all, the pressure, the sense of being accompanied by something that was aware of him in a way that went beyond predator and prey. He said he'd described this experience over the following years to other long-distance hikers and had found, he thought, 6 or 7 others who described something structurally similar in different wilderness areas across the country. Not the same locations, not the same trails, but the same quality of the experience. The stopping sounds, the moved objects, the sustained sense of a nearby presence with no visible source. He said he believed there were things in certain wilderness areas, old things, that were aware of human presence in a way that was neither predatory nor indifferent. He said the moved objects were the part he'd spent the most time thinking about. They weren't random, they weren't chaotic. They were small adjustments, precise in their smallness. And he believed they were communicative, a demonstration of access. We were here. We could have done more. We chose not to. I asked him why they would choose not to. He thought about it for what felt like an actual amount of time, not a theatrical pause. Then he said he believed there was something like policy at work, something that had decided for reasons of its own on a set of behaviors when it came to humans in its territory, and that the experience he and the others had described was the edge of that policy, the place where the normal distance was reduced, where the demonstration was made, and where whatever it was decided how much further to go. He picked up his pack and said good luck with the miles north of here. The conversation was over the way conversations sometimes just end, cleanly without requiring anything further. I've thought about the word policy almost every day since. Not the paranormal framing of it, which I can take or leave. The specific word. Policy implies deliberation. Policy implies a governing intention, a decision made from a position of choice. Whatever was out there, in Harlan's accounting and in his own private accounting of the others he'd spoken to, had decided. And what it decided every time was to come close enough to be known and no closer. I've been in a remote wilderness probably 40 times since that conversation. I've had nights where the woods felt wrong and nights where they felt fine, and I've never been able to determine what makes the difference. I think about Harlan standing at the water cache, deciding whether to say what he was going to say. I think about the 6 or 7 people he'd spoken to who each had their own version of the pressure and the stop sounds and the moved objects. I think about the deliberate smallness of the adjustments, the 18 inches, the open notebook page. Small enough to be denied, large enough to be known. I know what I think they meant. I just can't prove it. Story 13. I am a wildlife biologist. My name is Dr. Ingrid Solhaug, and I'm 43 years old, and I have done fieldwork in remote environments on 5 continents over the course of a 20-year career. I am telling you this because I need you to understand the professional and experiential baseline I'm working from when I tell you that what happened during a 7-day assessment in the Boundary Waters canoe area, wilderness in northern Minnesota, was the most disturbing thing I've encountered in 2 decades of working in places most people never go. I was accompanied by a doctoral student I'll call Patrick. He has asked that his name not be used, and I'm respecting that. Patrick is a serious scientist, careful, methodical, not prone to dramatic interpretation. This matters. We were doing a territorial assessment of wolf activity in a section of the BWCA that sees minimal recreational traffic, permitted and equipped appropriately, with a detailed field plan and regular check-in protocols. Between us, we brought decades of field experience and the kind of equipment that makes professional-grade observations possible. We were not there to have experiences. We were there to collect data. The first 4 days were genuinely excellent. Good data, exceptional conditions, the quality of solitude that allows you to hear the environment operating without the interference of human presence. We were both in the particular state of focus that good field work produces, paying attention to everything without being distracted by anything. Day 5, Patrick found the first carcass, an adult female deer in a small clearing about 60 meters off our route. The condition of the carcass was immediately and completely wrong for any cause of death I had encountered in 2 decades of field work. The animal had not been fed upon, not by wolves, not by the black bears that were active in the area, not by the corvids that would have located it within hours of death. The carcass was whole, undisturbed, lying on its side with its legs extended straight, in the center of a clearing that had no cover, no reason for a deer to shelter there, no natural reason for the animal to be in that position. External examination showed no injury, no sign of disease progression, no bloat indicating time since death, beyond what the temperature suggested, which was recent. We documented it thoroughly. We did not have an explanation. We moved on. That night, Patrick was awake for most of it. In the morning, he played me a recording he'd captured on his field recorder several hours after dark. The calls were recognizably wolf in their frequency and tonal range. But Patrick, who has been studying wolf communication for 6 years, said they were wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. The structural elements that distinguish wolf vocalizations from other canid sounds, the specific phrasing of group coordination calls, the harmonic relationships and territorial declarations were absent or present in incorrect forms. The recording sounded like wolf, but not, he said, like wolves. We agreed on this assessment. We looked at each other across the breakfast fire and understood that we had agreed, and that the agreement meant something we hadn't fully decided how to hold. Day 6 afternoon, we found a second carcass, another female deer. Same presentation, same position, same absence of predation or scavenging. 4 miles from the first in different terrain, in a second small clearing with no natural reason for the animal to have been there. Patrick stood beside me looking at it, and neither of us said anything for a long time. We worked the rest of the day with a quiet between us, It felt different from the comfortable quiet of the first 4 days. Something had shifted in the information we were carrying, and we were both processing it separately. The last night, night 7, I woke at some point in the early hours to silence. Total silence. Not the partial quiet of late night in the BWCA, which always retains some ambient layer. Complete cessation. Every insect, every small movement in the undergrowth, every sound the water makes at the edges of a lake, gone. In my experience, that quality of silence, the all-at-once kind, indicates something substantial moving through the environment. Something large enough or alarming enough to silence everything simultaneously. I put my hand on Patrick's shoulder, and he was already awake. We lay still in our bags and listened to the silence. Something moved around our camp in a slow circuit. I timed it. The full circuit took approximately 4 minutes. I could not identify the footfall. I have been in proximity to black bears and wolves and moose, and each has a distinctive pattern of movement. This did not match any of them. The pace was too even, too slow, too deliberate. Around toward the back of the tent. Then it stopped. It stood behind the tent. I watched my watch in the darkness. 7 minutes. 7 minutes of something standing motionless behind the tent where we slept. I do not know what it was. I have no candidate that satisfies the acoustic and behavioral evidence. Patrick, who is more willing than I am to say out loud what he does not know, said later that he spent those 7 minutes trying to determine if it was breathing and could not. My field recorder was running on the side of the tent. When I analyzed the recording later, back at home, in a lab environment with proper equipment, the 7 minutes of that standstill showed something I had not detected with my ears in the field. A sustained subsonic frequency, below normal human hearing range, consistent in amplitude, variable in frequency in a narrow band, not naturally produced by wind or water or geological activity. Something was producing a subsonic signal, deliberately and consistently, for 7 minutes outside our tent. I have shared this recording with 2 colleagues who work in bioacoustics. Both confirm the frequency and its characteristics. One of them asked me to send him any additional material and then stopped responding to my messages. The other called me on a Saturday afternoon and said, in words I have memorized, that she did not know what had made that sound and that she didn't want to know, and that she thought I should consider whether I wanted to know either. The thing left before dawn. We broke camp in the dark and paddled out without discussing what we were doing or why. We filed a standard field report. I noted the carcasses and their unusual presentation. I did not include the audio recording in the official report. I have continued my fieldwork. I applied for reassignment away from the BWCA and received it without difficulty. My supervisor asked once in passing why I'd requested the change, and I told him I'd encountered some conditions that warranted further assessment before returning to the area. He accepted that, and we've never returned to it. What I carry from those 7 days is this: 2 deer presented identically, with no explanation that satisfies the available evidence. Vocalizations that sounded like wolves but weren't. A complete circuit of the camp by something I could not identify. 7 minutes of stillness and a subsonic frequency whose source and purpose I cannot name. And the knowledge that whatever was out there, standing behind our tent in the dark of the last night, had decided to be known. Not seen, not heard in any ordinary sense. Known. And then it left. I think about the decision implied in that. The capacity to be unknown and the choice not to be. Whatever was in those woods had been there the whole time, through every day of the survey, through the carcasses and the wrong wolves in the circuits of our camp. And on the last night it decided that leaving without communicating was not the choice it was going to make. I don't know what it communicated. I know it communicated something. I think about that almost every day. That's all for tonight. And I want to be honest with you, some of these accounts have sat with me in a way that very few things do. Darren and the voices that kept their distance through 2 days and 2 nights of trail. Celeste and the note with her name on it, placed on a path she was walking alone. Dr. Solhaug and the subsonic frequency and the 7 minutes, and the decision implied by both. Garrett running 8 miles at a pace he's never matched, and the man who was at the bottom of the switchback when the physics of the situation said he couldn't be. I think about these people a lot. About what it costs to carry something you can't explain. About what it means to finally put it somewhere outside yourself. If any of this got under your skin, if any of it reminded you of an experience you've had or heard about, leave it in the comments below. This channel runs on those accounts. Your experience might be the next thing we cover, and I genuinely want to hear it. If you aren't subscribed yet, please take 5 seconds and do that right now. This channel is built on stories just like these, and new ones come in every week. The people who share them have trusted us with something real, and the least we can do is make sure as many people hear them as possible. Hit subscribe. It's free, and it means we keep doing this. And if you want to do one more thing for the channel, share this video with someone who you think needs to hear it, or someone who definitely shouldn't, right before a solo camping trip. Either way, you're helping us grow, and you're putting these stories where they belong. Stay careful out there. Pay attention to the quiet, and I'll see you next time.